Hello, so welcome to our week 2 podcast. Again, I'm doing this so you can come to class completely prepared to jump right into discussion as we go forward. The agenda for class for week 2, we'll start off with a discussion of One Day in September. Then we'll cover the 4 waves of terrorism with emphasis on the post-colonial phase. And then we'll go into my favorite discussion. What is terrorism? What is not terrorism? Why do we think certain actions are terrorism while others are not? And I will tell you again, this is my favorite class to teach all year because we really get into the history, which is always a passion of mine, but we get into those nitty-gritty discussions of what is terrorism, what isn't. And we'll talk about it more as we get in, but it usually is the most lively discussion we have all year. But let me just start off with One Day in September. This is, many of you probably knew about the Munich massacre, the massacre of Olympic athletes back in 1972, of Israeli athletes. But I think this really highlighted the bungling that occurred and the lack of a counterterrorism capability in Germany. As you've seen, the 1972 Olympics, as you saw in the documentary, Germany, this was Germany's re-release. They did not want to be associated with the Nazi regime, which wasn't, it was only 30 years prior to that, and this was their coming out. So they wanted lax security, and they wanted to give the impression that they weren't a militaristic society. So that was a key point going forward. Of why the security was bungling. The other issue is, just like the United States, Germany has a federal system, so they don't have a national counterterrorism capability or even national military capability. They had to use the police elements of the different states, and you saw the bungling that occurred, where certain police elements could operate but couldn't cross the state boundaries, and that led to, or was at least a contributing factor to the failures around what you saw in the documentary. That is third wave, and we'll talk about the waves in a second, but that is particularly the typical third wave of terrorism. This is a new left Palestinian terrorism that arose a few years prior to that. And you see this is probably the biggest event of it. The other thing to take away is, I can't emphasize this enough, terrorism is a media operation. It is a public relations communication operation. In One Day in September, that was the first time 24-hour news or a 24-hour event was in color on TV in 1972. So you had the whole world watching in a new medium, and the terrorists knew that, and they knew they could take advantage of it, and that's what you saw in the documentary. One other thing to point out is the not only the lax structures that Germany had, but even the lax attitude towards terrorism. And you saw the hijacking there. It was debated whether it was staged in the documentary. We know now it was staged. That the Germans didn't, they had a very hands-off approach to terrorism. Hard to believe now in our post 9/11, but during Wave 3, you had dozens of airplane hijackings. And it took a while for the international community to put basic standards of aviation security, metal detectors, and searches for weapons. So that's kind of the key points from One Day in September. We'll discuss it more in class. But again, the key points, the failure terrorism response, as well as the use of communications medium. And you saw that in the documentary. So shifting to the 4 waves of terrorism, this is a very neat package for this article that describes the history of terrorism going on to the present day. I will just warn you that this is, again, it might be a neat, nicely defined package, but it's not as smooth as the article says. Terrorism comes in different time periods, but just because one ends doesn't mean it has completely gone away. And just because one begins doesn't mean it's the first time. So you kind of get the years, but they're a lot more intermixed than the article might imply. But again, it's a good package of the history of terrorism, particularly in the 20th century and on. And the things to look about the waves. Each wave has its own justification, its own ideology, and its own communications medium. So the wave one is the anarchist phase. This started with the 1880s down to the 1920s, and the backdrop was the robber baron era, where there was a perception that the government was supporting the robber barons and the exploitive wages or exploitive companies that were dominating the time period of the time. And if you're an anarchist, you wanted to destroy the power base, you attack the government, and essentially, if you attack the government, these businesses will no longer operate. Anarchists, 1880s to 1920s. President McKinley was shot. That was probably their largest crime. Arguably, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which started World War I, was an anarchist, although there's certainly historical debate. And there was bombings in Washington, bombings in Arlington that were very relevant in the late teens and 20s as well. Again, their justification was against the government. Their communications medium was daily newspaper print. The literacy was becoming more widespread. Circulation of newspapers were becoming daily, and news was being transported over. So this was a way to get their message across. So that came about 1880s to 1920s, and then you have Wave 2, which really started after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, but really accelerated after the Second World War. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second, but these were the post-colonial operations. For those of you who remember back in history, most of the world was colonized by either the British, the French, or the Dutch. And after World War II, the world starts to become decolonized, and there was a lot of violence and violent activity in response. This is also the communication strategy was the emergence of TV, the emergence of visual mediums that these groups took advantage of to get their message across. Wave 3, that is what you saw on One Day in September, New Left, Secular. Some of these groups were ETA, the Red Brigades. PFLP was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Really, the start date is in 1967 after the Six-Day War, and we'll talk about that next week in more detail, but bottom line is Israel took over the Palestinian territories that are still hotly contested today, and by doing so, they set off a wave of terrorism, much of it supported by the old Soviet Union, and some of it was separatist groups like an ETA, which is a separatist group in Spain. Red Brigade were separatist groups in Germany. And then, again, you'll see the Munich Massacre as their primary, as a big event that occurred. But again, they were taking advantage of the new technologies, the new widespread use of TV, color TV, and digital media. And then Wave 4 is the religious. This is Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and to a lesser extent, Christian extremists. This is 1990s to the present day. And again, the big difference between here is other groups might have a political rationale, but if you have a religious rationale, there are less limits on the body count. You are more willing to increase the casualty cost. And you saw that on 9/11, and you see that in other events that occur. And now we go to what is possibly Wave 5, and most people would argue that the fifth wave of terrorism is called ethno-nationalistic terrorism. These are right-wing extremists, white nationalists. China, you can make the argument that the Han, pro-Han ethnic groups at the expense of the Uyghurs and other Chinese ethnic groups. In India, Hindu nationalists against the Muslim minority are taking control You have the cow vigilantes, and these are people who because cows are sacred in right-wing Hindu religion, they would, if they hear about abuse of a cow, then they would conduct retribution attacks. So you could argue that this is the fifth wave. I will argue that we've had right-wing extremist terrorism happen well before the 1990s. You're going to see later on documentaries about Oklahoma City, which happened in 1993. The Ku Klux Klan was a right-wing extremist, and that occurred in the 60s. And the original Ku Klux Klan occurred in the early part of the century. So you can make the argument that we're now in the fifth wave, that right-wing extremists, right-wing nationalist terrorism is the cause du jour, but we will see that going. Let's just say it didn't start in the last few years. So shifting to the going back to wave two, and this is the post-colonial wave of terrorism. As I mentioned, much of the developing world was colonized by the British, French, and Dutch. When World War II happened, the Dutch and French were occupied. Much of their colonies in Asia, whether it's Indonesia or in Indochina, were occupied by the Japanese. The British were weakened during the war, and there was suddenly an emphasis to decolonize. If you're in Indochina and you're under French rule, and then the Japanese take over, and then the French try and come back after the war, you're going to be less compliant with what the being under French rule. So that was kind of the basis. It started to happen after World War I, but really World War II was the accelerant, and it unleashed a wave of nationalism throughout the world. In Indochina, Algeria, and Mau Mau in Kenya as well. And you see this occur quite significantly. And I think the big thing is they understood media operations. We'll talk about that in a second, but the FLN, the Irgun, they were fighting in Algeria or they were fighting in Israel, but they wanted to influence operations outside of that area. So they used, again, the emergence of wireless technology, of teletype photography, of radio to get their message out. So I want to just hit the two case studies, again, are the Irgun and the FLN. The Irgun, as you read about, was an Israeli separatist group, desire for a Jewish homeland, and that really accelerated after the Second World War in the backdrop of the Holocaust. So their political objective was to remove the British influence in the Palestinian territory. Secondary, they wanted to limit Palestinian influence, but their real target was the British. And they wanted to use terrorism to bring attention to the Jewish plight. And that was their big goals. And they were successful. They understood that British was weak, the Britons were weakened after World War II, that there'd be extreme sympathy for the Jewish cause after the Second World War, and they did engage in violence. We talked about the King David Hotel on your discussion boards, but they did engage in violence, and they used the media at the time to influence the United Nations, which was just starting at the time. So the discussion questions that I'm going to bring up is this terrorism? And does the backdrop of the Holocaust, the annihilation of the Jewish people, allow for certain activity? So just think about that question going forward. And then the second case study will be the FLN in Algeria. We may think of Algeria as an independent country now, but really for much of the 19th century and the 20th century, Algeria was considered part of France, the way we would consider Alaska or Hawaii as part of the United States. So it wasn't just a colony. It was something that French had invested heavily in. There was many Algerians that were sympathetic to the French, many who did not want the French to leave. There were many in the French military that did not want to let Algeria go. And so the FLN started a campaign of terror, and they focused first on the French military. However, when they realized it wasn't going to work, they focused on civilian populations. And many of the things that you see in the news, suicide bombings, bombings against civilians, bombings under burqas, that was started by the FLN. They're their original influence. And many of you consider them kind of freedom fighters in your discussion boards because they were fighting a post-colonial phase. But they did some very brutal things, very nasty things, and they engaged in some heinous violence against the French. And if you've studied this in counterinsurgency, if you're coming from the military, a lot of criticisms on the French and their tactics, which is true because they resorted to torture, they resorted to mass population movements, but FLN were doing some pretty nasty things too. And then also I'll go back, was this killing justified? And we'll talk about oppression and does the FLN deserve it? And we'll ask the next question is, does brutality work? And I'll give you the answer, yes. In this case, brutality worked. So those are the two case studies we'll cover in this. And then we'll go into my favorite, what is terrorism, what isn't. We'll have a small video on Mark McGuinness, who was part of the IRA, and he engaged in terrorism, but then he kind of flipped. I don't want to say flipped. He became more of a political entity. But there is blood on his hands, innocent blood on his hands. And so the argument is he a terrorist? Well, he doesn't think so, but millions of people do. And we'll get into detail on that case study. But I do want to cover the case study about what is terrorism. And there's a cliche, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorism, and is another man's terrorist. We're going to talk about certain people. Arafat, we considered a terrorist. Then we considered him a partner in peace. And then we went back to considering him a terrorist. Nelson Mandela. Mandela is often grouped with Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And he probably shouldn't be, because he engaged in mass violence. That's why he was arrested. He wanted to target the apartheid apparatus of government. So we'll go into what is terrorism, what isn't. Again, we have to define it. We have to have a definition because we have to have an internationally recognized one. And our nominal definition is a non-state actor targeting civilians using low-level tactics that has a political objective. But there's a problem with each one of these definitions, whether it's a non-state actor, whether it's a targeting civilians, low-level tactics with a political objective. And we'll get into the problems of each in a second. And then we're going to just start with our discussion with the case studies we assigned on the discussion board. Why do we think each one is terrorism? Why do we think each one is not? Explain your rationale. And the more you talk about that in the discussion, the more fruitful your paper will be, which your paper is due next week. So as you're thinking about this and as you're going into the discussion or the discussion for what is terrorism, think of the facets of what is terrorist or not, whether it's attacking civilians, whether it's using low-level tactics, whether it's attacking military, whether it's etc. Those are how I want you to organize your paper going forward. Okay, so I think that's a good discussion. I look forward to seeing you in class, and if there's questions or issues, let me know.